the traditional definition of strategy being about goals and plans,
Right.
to me it's always been a little boring to me because it's like one-dimensional or even two-dimensional. But to me, where strategy gets interesting and exciting is in figuring out how. For example, let's say that you've been trying to improve time to market. It's taking you too long to develop products. And, you hire somebody that tells you, well, this is what you need to do. And you would say, I've known the what for a long time. It's the how. We still haven't figured it out.
Welcome to the Spark Ideas Podcast. I'm John Yerian, your guide in this journey to sparking something new in your career or your life. This is a show about starting things, about empowering people to connect with others, and about making a difference in the world through collective action. In each episode, I have the privilege of discussing foundational ideas of life and work with some of the most insightful leaders across a range of industries, from technology to hospitality, from journalism to sports. You'll be inspired by how they bring these ideas to life, to help you apply them in your own work and life, and to spark your own journey. Ricardo Lopez has been a leader of strategic growth in the hospitality and travel business for more than 25 years. He has helped both InterContinental Hotels Group and Taca Airlines grow and expand their commercial operations through marketing, sales, and strategic planning, while also delivering excellence in customer service and corporate partnerships. He is now the Chief Growth Officer for Reunitus, an integrated company specializing in lost and found solutions. Ricardo has a passion for growth, excellence in execution, and leading with purpose. He is a native of El Salvador and lives in Atlanta with his wife and 5 children. Ricardo Lopez, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure, and like every episode, we're going to unpack a word, a concept, and something that I think all of our listeners probably have a feeling that they already know what it means. That's a word they're familiar with. But we'll talk about your relationship to it, or what it means to you, and that word today is strategy.
Okay.
And ironically, we're going to improvise a conversation about strategy. We'll make it up as we go. But to begin, I would simply ask I would start with, how do you apply strategy in your work today? Where does that show up for you?
Mm-hmm. I would say the majority of the strategy that I work with is growth strategy, growing things. And also I've worked a lot with transformation strategy, which, is related. But definitely trying to figure out how to take things to the next level, where to go, and then how to get there. I see strategy as a means to an end, accomplishing bigger goals. But the majority of what I like to work with or that I end up working with is growing things. Which is
such a fun way to think about it, because, and we'll talk for a minute about growing businesses or products or things like that. But when I think about growth, if I'm being honest, I often think of it as almost like an organic, spontaneous, maybe it has something to do with popularity or it just clicks. And when I hear you mention strategy, what comes up for me is this, patient process of like analysis or prediction, right? To plan for growth. Is that how it is for you, or would you say it differently?
It is. Plan in many ways sounds static to me. Strategy is almost like an iterative process, where it's like an approach. You're attacking something. Let's say you haven't been able to grow in some time. There's reasons why you haven't been able to grow. So you just need to really find multiple angles to attack that problem. And I personally prefer emerging strategy that you fine tune as you go. I'm not a big fan of strategies that take a long time to be signed off, because you still don't know if that's going to work. So it's almost like it's enough of a game plan to get you going, but then you really need to fine tuning that as you go.
Yep. I think we'll have a lot of listeners who, when they hear the word strategy, what they picture is a PowerPoint or a keynote that they saw 2 or 3 quarters ago, and the meeting was great, and they sort of half remember it, but it's not like they dust it off before they make a decision, right? It's just this hurdle they kind of get through, but it doesn't necessarily govern or guide their behavior. I'm hearing you point at something a little bit different, of strategy as like showing up in day-to-day decision-making, or as you put it, iterative, maybe more quickly revisiting to test against. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. That's accurate. I mean, for multiple reasons, it's where I've landed, partly as a reaction, just going through processes where you're spending a lot of money, even on consultants, and you go through lots of research and lots of stage gates, and you end up talking so much that, people who are geared towards action are, by the time you sign it off, it's very frustrating. But it could also lead to paralysis, where you made it so high stakes that now nobody wants to make a decision.
I tend to notice hesitation around strategy, or I should say like specificity in strategy. Mm-hmm. Because once you go there, you open up the possibility of failure. Like you could compare and then know. And so there's comfort in moving in a way that's unstrategic or maybe more unplanned, because it removes that threat for us of having had the wrong strategy, having made the wrong assumptions. Do you see that, or how do you combat that?
I see that. I think in some ways tech opened our eyes to this idea of emerging strategy. You know how they used to launch everything in beta mode, so they're not making big promises. You're actually building a lot of forgiveness for failure, but you know that it's promising enough to put some efforts towards it. And
can you give somebody a more concrete example of like, here was a thing, we wanted it to grow, I applied a strategy to it, and here's kind of how it worked, or here's what I learned through that process?
Mm-hmm. Recently, I've been hired as Chief Growth Officer for a company, and in many ways that's business development, in many ways that's sales, but you have to have strategy, because you can't just sell more, sell faster. There's a reason why companies have an appetite to grow that hasn't been fulfilled. We're really putting all levers in front. It could be pricing, you could grow through charging more. It's new products too. It could be a different way of contracting and just innovating how you bring in a new customer. And it's also helping the organization to be ready to scale when the growth comes, because otherwise you're creating a pipeline that doesn't seem sustainable.
I noticed earlier when we were talking about strategic planning processes, and you made a reference to people or stakeholders, and I forget exactly how you said it, but that who have like a bias to action or are action oriented. Mm-hmm. And you said that in a way that made me think that you didn't necessarily self-identify as one of those people. Mm-hmm. You were different. Is that accurate?
It is. I'm really in the middle. I'm equally good at development and equally good at task, or equally good at strategy and equally good at operations. But I've done enough team buildings and just developmental workshops where you realize a lot of people are on the two extremes. Some people go absolutely crazy if there's a huddle to figure it out, because they just want to try and go. And you see, they're almost pulling away from the table because they really want to go. And there's people who almost want to write it out, and it's those groups that do create tension, I think, in organizations where, there's groups that are always coming up with more questions. And then there's groups who don't really care. They just want to go.
Right.
And I think harnessing that is important, because both are needed.
Why is really married and executed strategy in kind of short supply? Why aren't people better at it?
It's a good question. And I have seen that. I've seen how there's strategies that once they're developed, they're literally shelved. Somebody puts them in a file, and then nobody remembers what had been agreed. So I used to lead planning process and strategy for many years, and I would always try to make it much more connected to what you would do when you came back to the office, but also enough to make it worthwhile that you paid for this time to have space for thinking. And one of the things that worked was you could talk about strategy, but then think about what date we're in. Let's say if you're in August, you should be thinking about how to finish the year strong. And since the year is going to finish very quickly, you should also be thinking about how to start the year strong. And so it would always be a nice bridge from the high level to what you do differently when you come back to the office, because you would see people even looking at their calendars, realizing that, maybe a lot of the meetings that they had weren't aligned to what we just said were the biggest goals.
Right. Have you ever heard a voice in your head telling you to ask for a raise, start a business, or switch careers? Maybe you should. This episode is brought to you by the new book, Spark, 24 Concepts to Ignite, Unstick, or Supercharge Your Work Life. Learn more at sparkbook.com. Well, it's a fascinating skill set to be able to apply it organizationally, because you reference, our goals or the company's goals. Well, guess what? Every person in that company has their own goals. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe they're saying them out loud, maybe they're not. But there's always going to be some distance there. There's a little bit of tension between what we want, right, collectively, and what I want. And typically what the individual wants is, I would like to keep my job. I would like to improve it. I would want more authority or more resources. And I find that, one of the impediments to organizational strategy is groups of people just don't collectively want any one thing enough to clearly define it. Roles like yours, where there's a board or a C-suite that gets really clear that, hey, we just got to do what's necessary. We can't have sales and marketing just fight all the time. We need a real strategy. We need to get bigger. Is that common to your experience? Do you see that as well?
It helps to have that almost like platform, like very hot or even burning platform, to really cause a lot of the, distractions to go away, or even to give people that boldness to speak up. Maybe the unspoken, which is that there may have been conflicting objectives, or that honestly they just haven't shifted to what we said we would do this, but the day-to-day has so much of a hold on people's calendars that it has a real tension with growth. In the case of the company that I just joined, there is a bit of a good separation between existing business, which is very important. You don't want to, let's say that you have big renewals with customers coming up, or you have big customers. You don't want the strategic goals to be coming in the way of that. But you also, if you don't really go all in on the goals that are, if you don't go all in on a business that right now seems small compared to the existing big business that you have, it'll never get big. And so I think this idea of chief growth officer is becoming a little more common.
Yep.
But also, if there's not that type of role, teams that can incubate. So, you might have like what's called like a tiger team, or a team that has the space to be free from that day-to-day.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Well, we're working our way up to actually defining strategy. I promise we'll do it here in a minute. It's a little warning. You can be thinking about it. But before then, as we continue to kind of talk around it, I imagine we have any number of people who don't occur for themselves as having some of your gifts. They certainly haven't had your experience. They would like to bring more strategy into their company or their leadership, right? They want that. They want to feel organized and like they know where they're going or how to get there. Mm-hmm. What are some concrete tips or advice you would offer to them in an effort to have them think strategically, which we've defined as distinct from like having a PowerPoint you don't look at, right? Two different things. Mm-hmm. What would enable better strategic thinking for anybody else?
I think being able to break it down enough to really knowing what you're doing is important. A lot of times I've seen plans that have the goals, they have the initiatives, but then it's all still very high level. Right. So you go 2-3 levels into the organization and nobody really knows what that means for them. And so I personally like to go deep and at the same time realize that that's just a hypothesis. The plan will change, and people need if I give you a plan that seems like it's all cooked, I don't want you to think that you have to follow it perfectly, because then I'm presuming that I know better when we haven't even started. But it's enough for people. I've seen, it's like giving somebody a really good brief and then empowering them. It makes them feel like they know enough to go. The traditional, and maybe we're getting to definition here, but the traditional definition of strategy being about goals and plans,
right,
to me feels, it's always been a little boring to me, because it's like one-dimensional or even two-dimensional. But to me, where strategy gets interesting and exciting is in figuring out the how. For example, let's say that you've been trying to improve time to market. It's taking you too long to develop products. And, you hire somebody that tells you, well, this is what you need to do. And you would say, I've known the what for a long time. It's the how. We still haven't figured it out. Sometimes it's that you haven't really given yourself the time and space to figure it out. And sometimes it is that you really don't have anybody in the company that can figure it out.
Well, and I think a lot of times organizations simply lack the will or the capacity to learn. They won't commit themselves to the knowledge gathering, the analysis necessary to develop a real strategy. I see a lot of strategies that kind of look like the goal is lose 10 pounds and the tactic is go to the gym. And it's like, okay, there's a bunch missing. Are we going to run? Are we going to lift? And by the way, how would we know it's working? What are the success metrics that would have us know that running is actually the path to the goal? The gym is an acceptable tactic, but it's just not nearly specific enough. You just get in there and wander around and nothing will happen. But in order to break through that, I or my organization would have to commit ourselves to learning about fitness. I would have to raise the IQ on what is effective and what isn't. And I think that can be a big barrier as well. We just sort of stop short and then default to what we already know or what we've done before, and then kind of repeat the same goals to each other. I would think that that's something you break through every day. That's the opposite of what you're doing. Is that fair?
It is fair. I think leaders set the tone for learning, and I did learn early on from, I worked with several leaders who they had habits where they would be learning through the day, no matter how senior they were. A lot of times senior leaders are in back-to-back meetings, and so there's no space for their curiosity. Because a lot of people are very curious. You might have, you're in a meeting and somebody brought a big question and you're like, I really like to know the answer for that. But if you're in that tyranny of back-to-back meetings, you will be accumulating open questions. And I learned early on to block my calendar to find out answers to questions and to enjoy the process. The process can be as simple as, I'm going to make a few phone calls today and ask people what they think about this.
It's such a simple hack, and I promise you there are people listening and watching for whom that has not occurred to them. Because that impulse to be busy and to be seen to be busy, right, and therefore valuable and whatever, and this notion that you would block time to just find things out, like you're a private detective. I'm just going to get to the bottom of this.
Yeah.
And then you show up in a meeting and people act like you're 10 feet tall, and it's like, guys, I just looked it up. I called some customers. I did this crazy thing. I talked to customers and they told me. I think that's a really fun takeaway, is just maybe cancel a couple meetings and try to figure some stuff out. That's great.
Yeah. And I really think it is true that people transact in terms of busyness. How busy are you? Pretty busy. How busy are you? Super busy. Okay. And then we're both good because we're busy.
That's right.
To me, what that sounds is like you have no margin to grow. And I've always liked to keep a good percentage. I want to say 30% of my calendar free, which is tough because everybody's asking, for one-on-ones or recurring calendars that end up taking over your calendar. So I've gotten good about saying no to pre-commitments, and even with one-on-ones, I try not to have weekly one-on-ones or even monthly one-on-ones because I'm available. People can text me, people can call me. My calendar will have time. If you need me,
But the burden of proof should be on the reason for needing you, not the mere fact that I have a calendar item.
Yeah, the agenda. What's the agenda? And sometimes it might sound rude, but it's not. It's really not personal at all. It's more of.
I think the more people experience you and their time with you as being committed around getting something done, pretty quickly that shows up as a positive. It looks like, okay, this is a guy that's going to advance my career. This is a woman who's going to help me get to the next level. That initial reaction can be a little bit awkward, but the more we show up for others, like their time is valuable too, right?
True.
Not just yours.
That's a good point.
There's a really important demonstration in there that says, hey, when we get together, something's going to happen. We're not just going to stare at each other. And with that in mind, making something happen, it is now time to attempt to define this.
Okay.
And we're going to work through it. So it doesn't be, you don't have to stick the landing on the first one. But I'll ask it two ways and you can answer whichever way you prefer. What does the word strategy mean to you, or what does it mean to think strategically? You can take it either way. But what actually is it?
I guess starting with strategy, I think it's really the what and the how. And the what, to your point, requires people to have the conversation of what we're going after. It's not just goals, but it could also be ambition. It could be vision. It could be that you've had plans with no vision. So that's not a strategy. That's just stuff. It's just activity. Or it could be a vision that doesn't have plans. So soon it starts sounding like a dream instead of a strategy. So it's a really good marriage between going after something, and that something could be anything from market share to new presence in a new market. But then the how you're going to do it, and the how is not just plans, because a lot of times plans sound almost naive because they don't really have research behind them, or they might not have answers to some obvious questions that people might be saying, which is, it sounds easy to beat that competition, but how are we going to beat them? Or what do we have that they don't really have? And if we don't have it now, how are we going to develop that edge?
I think a good strategy should always present us with the risk of exposing ourselves as incorrect. It should go far enough that it could be disproven. Or in a later point in time, prove itself out to be the correct course of action. But it would have to be enough that there would be some risk in it, because the point is we're going somewhere we haven't been before. It's the whole idea. That's why you'd have a strategy.
True.
Right? So there have to be assumptions and theories, and they have to be specific enough so that they create action and forward momentum. And then we have to live in that strategy, right? And this is where this can feel uncomfortable, because it's that possibility of failure comes up. But the good news is whenever failure is possible, there's this other thing called success, which is crazy.
Yeah.
When you find it, it's really worth it. I can't recommend it enough. And so, a good strategy to me should make you a little nervous. It should push you and the people around you. Do you think that's fair?
It's fair. It happens to me often that, in some ways, I like to tell strategy as a story.
Yep.
And you become a good storyteller over time, and I think I do that really well. And sometimes I'm telling such a good story that then I start realizing all the ways in which that story could end up being, a flop.
That's right.
Or that somebody would look back and say, that sounded good, but it's not nearly as good. But I really think it is about risk taking. So yes, these are all the ways in which it could go wrong. And yes, we're going to have risk mitigation, but you really can't compete if you're not able to get bruised.
Oh, I agree. A strategy should not be a PowerPoint. It should be a piece of paper that's a little bit crumpled up and has a little bit of sweat on it, maybe some tears. What a pleasure to be with you on the subject. All the best on the new gig, and congrats to them. And I really appreciate the time. Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you. Appreciate the topic. Very engaging.
Brought to you by the new book, Spark, 24 Concepts to Supercharge Your Work Life. Learn more at sparkbook.com.